of the Cycle 25 webcast, podcast, Zoomcast, whatever we decide to call this crazy Hub Not Club. I am super, super lucky today because I have one of my heroes on, Pete Juliano, N6QW, and he's going to be talking to us about the Hermes Lite 2. I think just about everybody knows Pete from the Solder Smoke podcast and other great stuff he does on various web locations and articles that we read from time to time. Pete, I cannot embellish your history at all, man. You're the legend. I'm just going to turn it over to you and let's talk about the Hermes.
Cool.
Why don't you start talking, and then I'm going to put the share screen up with your slides, and this should look good.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Rod, so much for the invitation to speak to the Cycle 25 Hub. When I first heard that, I thought it might be a car part, but then I found out it was something different. So there we go. And I wrote a little rhyme for this session today, and you can read it at your pleasure. But I have fun rhyming words, and it's all about Cycle 25 and how the HL2 fits in with that. But first, I do want to recognize that today is September the 11th. And 20 years ago today, all our lives changed, and I want to make sure we never forget. So I'm also want to include that I do have my chick magnet sunglasses, but they are not on at this time. So next slide, please.
Sorry, a little slow on the uptake. There you go.
Okay. We're going to look at the Hermes Lite and how to get started with this amazing transceiver. And I should tell you that I didn't actively pursue getting an HL2. It was kind of presented to me. Actually, I was contacted because I had built some homebrew SDR transceivers. And actually, KF70 contacted me and said, we'd like to loan you an HL2 and want you to put it on the air and test it out and then tell us what it's like, what your impression is, and what have you. And then when you're done, you need to return it. Well, I said, I'll be happy to do that, but I don't want to do what you suggest. I will buy one because then I have some skin in the game. And if I don't like it, I'm going to really tell you I don't like it. And if I do like it, I'm going to say, gee, that was a smart decision to buy that. So it's not something I was touring, websites and what have you, and said, hey, I need to get one of those. It was presented to me. And there's the way to get started with this. And first sign up for the reflector. And there's a website there that you can just click on that or connect to it. And it has all the information, even information like how to buy one. So we're going to cover that process here in a few minutes. But it's also important you smell the roses and understand what the trend is in our hobby and the equipment. More and more SDR stuff is showing up, whether it's in commercial boxes or standalone guys offering kits and what have you. And I'm suggesting you get an SDR dongle. You can find them for about $30, and it gives you a chance to really experience what it's like to have an SDR receiver in your shack. I mean, you can see some of these web SDRs, but when you play with the controls and you listen and all the things you can do, then it helps you convince you whether you want to proceed further and pony up and buy an HL2, which are not inexpensive, but not that expensive. And it also gives you a chance to become active and understand what people are talking about and see the benefits. And it gives you a chance to research the full capabilities and what it'll become. So there's a little process here. Sign up, get connected with the reflector, find out how you buy one. But in the meantime, get yourself a dongle. And, it's a good way to get started for a lot less money. Next slide, please. Okay, what is an HL2? And there's the Hermes Lite 2.0 up in the upper right-hand corner. And just exactly what is it? It's an all band. And they're currently on build 9, and build 9 is HF only. Now, there are some plans afoot to put transverters with this, and some work is being done so that the transverter would mate up nicely with it. It's not you're going to have to do a science project out of this, but it's all mode. You can do AM, FM, sideband, digital, upper CW, lower CW. It's network based, which makes it very, very nice because the original intent was you'd take this Hermes Lite, stuff it in your garage with a computer, and hook up a cable modem. And then anywhere that you can get access to the cable modem, you're on the air. You don't have to lug something around. So if it's like in a cold garage, you can be in your nice cozy den and get there with a laptop and be on the air. So it's really nice that it's network based and it's an SDR transceiver. Now, our friend Napoleon Dynamite, he's a typical HL2 owner. It's a real nerd rig. I mean, if you're a nerd, you can feel very comfortable operating an HL2. And if you're not, you can learn to be one. So Napoleon Dynamite approves it. Next slide. Okay, this is the eye catcher. And the eye catcher is, this software happens to be Quisk, and it has a thing called a band scope. You punch that band scope and you get to look at about 40 megahertz. And this picture was taken in January this past year. And if you'll note, 60 meters is pretty good. 40 meters is pretty good. The red indicates the amount of activity. It spills over a little bit into 20 meters. There's nothing on 80 or 75. Kind of misses 17 meters. And but the band scope lets you see and gives you a feel of the activity. Now, later on, you're going to see in one of the little short videos, we're on 40 meters and we're listening to a QSO. You can engage that band scope and it'll show you the band and not disturb what you're listening to. So if you're listening to a QSO on 40 and say, gee, I wonder what's like on 17 meters, hit the band scope and you'll see this kind of spectrum. Then you can revert back to the standard display that you would get with the waterfall and the spectrum. So I think that's kind of cool because if you're wondering what's cooking on the other bands, you don't have to move to the other band. Just hit the band scope and there you are. Now, what I found curious is my cursor is on 28085. It just happens to be there. And I spotted two signals just to the left of that. And they're pretty strong signals. And I looked down where the frequency is, and then I realized that must be some good old boys down where Frank lives, and they're cooking up some shine. And they have a little spare time, so they turned on to channel 4 with their big lean ears, and they're on the air. I mean, that is the only thing that I can account for those two signals at 27 megahertz. So you can get a really good feel where there's band activity. And I guess the Cycle 25 hub is really looking that whole screen gets turned red all the way through HF. That's what we're hope is going to happen. But this was in January of this year. So the band scope gives you a really good feel of what's going to happen. Next slide. Okay, there are several forms of SDR receivers and transmitters, and two significant ones are the direct digital conversion, and the other is the ICQ Sound Card based. And the HL2 is the direct digital conversion. So we got a signal coming off the air, we do a little RF amplification, and inside the ADC, that analog signal is converted to a digital stream. So that's why the network ends up being pretty nice, because that digital stream is just sent down a cable to a computer. Now, KF70 is the guy that's really responsible for the HL2. And in his day job, which I guess he's with a company that makes cable modems, he realized that a cable modem had what it takes to turn that into an SDR transceiver. So basically the guts of the HL2 in another life is a cable modem because it has the necessary analog to digital conversion. And now, while the band scope will look out at 40 megahertz, typically using the Quisk software, the max window you can look at is 384 kilohertz. Now that's kind of cool because you can center the band on 40 meters and you're looking at the whole band. Or you can center it on 20 meters, you're looking at the whole band. You don't quite see the whole band on 75 or 80, but you can move that window 384 kilohertz. So by just moving the window a little bit, you can look across the whole band. But for most of the ham bands, like 30 meters, 20 meters, 17 meters, 12 meters, no problem. You just center it up and you're looking at the whole band. You do have to move the window a little bit on 15 meters because, of course, that's 450 kilohertz. And on 10 meters, of course, it's 1.6 megahertz. But it'll give you a chance, and it's pretty easy to move that window around. So 384 kilohertz is kind of cool. We'll see that in some of the little videos. So next slide. Now, just in case you wanted to know what the sound card, that's the JICWTK, just in case you wanted to know, here's the ICQ Sound Card based system. Essentially, you look at the left, and we have a signal coming in from a bandpass filter. It goes to a ferrite core, which is a splitter combiner, and it provides RF signals to what's essentially two direct conversion receivers. Now, what we do is we feed an LO into those two direct conversion receivers, and that LO is 90 degrees out of phase. Essentially, you take a 28.8 megahertz signal and you divide it by 4 with the 74 AC4, and it actually splits it into two phases. So part of that splitting into two phases, 90 degrees out of phase, it divides it by 4. So that's why you have to start out with 4x and you end up with 1x. And those are fed into the LO ports. And essentially you produce two audio signals that are 90 degrees out of phase. Now, those of you that are familiar with the SI 5351, guys have come up with an A now to take the two clocks so you can generate the two signals at frequency 90 degrees out of phase. So you don't need the 74 AC 74. So you can just pump that signal in there. But the key is they're 90 degrees out of phase. And that 90 degrees out of phase lets the sound card and the computer do the processing. Now, the spectrum and waterfall is the same as you see with the HL2, but you're limited by the bandwidth of the sound card. So most standard stock sound cards are 48 kilohertz. So when you put the window out, you're only looking at 48 kilohertz at a time, unless you got one of those really expensive sound cards that lets you look at 96. So immediately the advantage is the HL2 lets you look at 384 kilohertz using the Quiz software. Now, there's somebody in the background jumping up and down saying, but my Flex 6400 can look out at 8 megahertz. So what are you telling me there? Yeah, but that Flex 6400 costs 10 times what that HL2. So if you want that, spend the money. But if you're looking to look at just the ham band that you're working on, get the HL2. So again, it's limited by 48 kilohertz. Now, this circuitry is bi-directional. So if I have RF coming in from the left and I go through the process, I end up with IQ audio. You can reverse that process. You can generate IQ audio and it'll work because these are all passive elements. You can actually produce a single sideband signal or digital signal going the other direction. Now, when you look at this, next slide, please. That's the whole hardware. That's about $30 worth of hardware right there of what you saw before. So you could actually build this whole thing for about $30. And it's got two ADE1s on it that you can now buy for about $5 a piece, a couple of modem transformers to reduce noise, upper right-hand corners of 74 AC 74. And so this is essentially what you saw in that schematic is exactly what is needed to produce an SDR signal, either receiving or transmitting. Now, interesting enough, you'll see a little double pole, double throw relay in there, and that's because I didn't catch something. What I found out is there's sideband inversion in the transmit with regard to the receive. In other words, I had this working in receive, and it was like on 40 meters lower sideband. When you go to transmit, it was transmitting an upper sideband. So I said, aha, I know how to fix that. Put a little relay in there. So I reversed the I and Q channels on transmit. So I and Q in one direction is different from I and Q in the other direction. That solved the problem. Except in the Quiz software, there's a little block you check. It says reverse the sideband on transmit. So had I caught the block, click the block tab, I wouldn't have needed the relay. But anyway, they've already thought about this in the software. So just to give you a feel, the IQ sound card based, less bandwidth, something you can build, but it does have some limitations not found in the HL2. So let's go back to the HL2 just so you know what the ICQ sound card based hardware is like. So next slide, please. Okay, now let's see if this will work. Click it so we get the sound. Okay, there we are operating in CW. And look how much of the spectrum you're looking at. I can barely hear the sound. Is there any way of turning up the volume?
See what I can do here.
There you go. Okay, well, one of the things is you can, if you hear the sound a little bit louder, you can actually hear the difference of the filtering. And you go on 200 hertz, boy, that thing really gets narrow, and it goes all the way up to, this is the Quiz software, so you have choice of 200, 400, 600, 1000, and 1500. So that's what's really nice is you have the capability. You can also, do things with the RF gain and the audio gain. So next slide. Now this is on sideband, and let's see if we can play that. There you go. Now you're going to see me a little bit later put the band scope on this, and so you can have the band scope while you're still listening to the contact. There's the waterfall.
One select of the switch antenna. Maybe give me a little feedback on the east-west antenna. So anyway, here's the east-west antenna. We're playing with it. It was fun last night on this particular antenna. I played Ole Miss for a while, but late.
You have a choice of 2000, 2200, and 3200. So quite a bit of range that you can set the audio band with.
Was the problem, but they were able to pull me out, give me signal response, and we visited them so briefly. They just had a tough time hearing me, but it was still fun.
Now watch, there's the band scope. Band scope.
Contact the same night, a carnival operation. That was a lot of fun. So back to you for a second, Larry. Maybe you give me some feedback. CF7FA, K7ONY.
Okay, now here's click it again. This is FT8 on 17 meters. FT8, 17 meters. I think the thing is significant. I can't hear it, but it's significant. You'll see a lot. You'll hear a lot of FT8 signals on 17 meters, and yet the band looks dead because people are not congregating on FT8. They're not getting on sideband or CW. So that's kind of a clue to you there. While you may tune across the phone band, it sounds dead, but actually on FT8 it's very active, and I have been noticing almost daily high amount of FT8 activity. And as a matter of fact, yesterday there was a lot of sideband activity. I actually heard a QSO with a guy down in Costa Rica talking to a guy in Japan. When have you heard that recently? Not very often. Okay, click that. This is the FT8, and it's linked with the HL2, so you can. There's the interconnect that these two programs are connected together. WSJTX. Some other bands are not too active. You can look see anything. 20 meters. 20 meters. Dirty. Time.
Monday, I haven't talked to Kelly about it, but we'll see. You know what we find out.
There you go.
But that's good.
Okay, next slide. First ever for me, 17 meter FT8. I worked a 3-day 2 in Fiji Island from Southern California, running 5 watts. First time I've ever worked Fiji in my life. I've been at this 62 years. First time I ever worked Fiji. So HL2, 5 watts, 17 meters, FT8. Now, if you look, I've called some other DX stations. You'll see some Japanese stations above there, and even one down in Cuba. So 17 meters and the 5 watt of the HL2 is like a perfect combination. So you can work a lot of DX, and this was August 24th. And since then, I've worked another Fiji station, a different station on 17 meters, 2 in a month, 62 years, 2 in a month. So this thing really works and works well. So next slide, please. Okay. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide because I think this is where all the detail is regarding the HL2. First up, swallow hard, all options plus shipping is not quite $400, but inching there. There's been a kind of a price increase in the basic HL2, mainly driven by what's happening with the COVID-19 and what's impacted the electronics industry in China. But there are several options, and these include the basic HL2 by itself is like about $255, something like that. But you want to get the other piece, which is the bandpass filter board that connects up with that, and they all together go together in one box. As a matter of fact, that bandpass filter board was designed by N2ADR, who's the designer of the Quist software. And then there's some shipping in there, and there's the case. And you need to get the case because part of it's got real RF transistors in there, and part of the case becomes part of the heat sinking. And there's another option in there. I haven't figured out what it is, but they charge $1 for assembly. So I figure $1 for assembly, I'd probably screw it up. So spend the $1. And then shipping doesn't come on the slow boat from China. They actually airship it via DHL. So it's not unusual. Once you buy one, in less than 3 or 4 days, you got it sitting there at your front door. So altogether, you add I think the air shipping was $35 or $40. So by the time you get one, you're inching close to $400. Now, build 9 is the latest build. Now they may be inching towards build 10, and I'll explain that in a minute. Is HF only. So if you're looking to look at VHF or UHF, there's some work being done. You can find information on the reflector with regard to transverters. It is all mode. It's AM, FM, sideband, CW, and it includes upper and lower sideband, upper and lower CW, upper and lower digital. And as a matter of fact, it's full duplex capable, but I've never operated it that way. But there's a little button you push on the Quist and says, okay, full duplex. It is 5 watts out. Now, I should tell you, I see better than 5 watts on virtually all bands, except for some unknown reason, 40 meters is 4.9 watts. So I say that's close enough to 5 watts, but some of them can do almost 6 watts. And so when it says it's 5 watts over the HF, believe it, it's true. And like some rigs have got an IR of 510 in it, you get 5 watts on 40 meters and 2 watts on 15. This is not the case. You will get 5 watts on 15 meters. It has a built-in SWR meter, and it's a real SWR power meter. They actually got a chip and a sensor in there so that when you look at the SWR, it's not an approximation. It's real. So believe it. And I got to tell you, I'm just amazed because I know where the low SWR is I use an antenna tuner with a delta loop. I know where the SWR is low on the delta loop, and it matches. So I know that's a real power meter, and you can, when it tells you it's 1.05, it's 1.05. They have the capability for linear amplifier switching. They have an open drain MOSFET in there, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But you can just plug in it. There's a RCA jack, plug into it, and relay switch. And I'm recommending you do something a little different. So far, I know of 6 software suites that you can use with the HL2. And I'm going to talk about those in a minute on an upcoming slide. You have the choice of Windows 10 or Linux operation. You can either, some of the software is Windows 10 only, while others is Linux, and some of them will offer options. You can either use the software, but you can use it in Windows 10 or Linux, and I want to talk a little bit about that. It is a semi-kit, and there's no solder required. The only operation that you have to do yourself is to put the boards together and put them inside the case and screw the case together, except you do have to locate one hole in the case, because that hole will line up with the heat sink, so that the case in effect becomes the heat sink. I've never found it to be running hot, but that's really important that you do that. Those are real RF transistors in there. Those are no IRF 510s or some MOSFETs first into service. They're real RF MOSFETs, so you have to do that. It's a high quality build. You inspect the boards, and it's no cold solder joints. It's all wave soldered. It's all made to very excellent specifications. It's operated on a network, and I think that's kind of cool. And I want to talk about that. There's an upcoming slide about a network. It's a small physical size. As a matter of fact, I know of a guy that had a sailboat that doesn't have much space, and he didn't have any ham gear in there, but he really wanted it. And when he saw the HL2, perfect. I mean, this thing is that small, and he could tuck it in a corner somewhere and be on the air. And he loads up the backstay of the antenna, and he's really happy camper. As a matter of fact, probably find a little linear somewhere that you can put in there and maybe get it up to 50 or 100 watts. But it's just perfect. Also kind of nice if you have a camper or RVer and you want to take a rig along with you. It's perfect. You want to go backpacking, take it with you, get a power supply, but you do need a computer. And there's a way around that, because you can operate this with a Raspberry Pi 3. So you can tug along a Raspberry Pi 3 and the HL2 and be on the air. There's user group support, and I'm going to make that statement somewhat guarded, user group support, and I'm going to talk about that. I think one of the most important features, it's a test device. I'll frequently put like a 3-inch antenna on it when I'm testing a sideband rig, and there's enough RF into a dummy load to be picked up by the HL2. I can look at the spectrum. I can look at the sidebands. I can see if there's real sideband suppression. I can see how wide the signal is. So, I mean, it's very, very useful from that standpoint. But then I'll share with you a case that took place here, and I bristle a little bit at a derisive term I use called the box top extra. Here in the U.S., they have the top license as the extra class, and we have people who memorize questions, know nothing about radio, sit down with a volunteer examiner, take that test, and memorized enough answers to become an amateur extra, have never touched a piece of equipment, have never lit off a soldering iron, and I call them box top extras. Like in the old days, you mail in a box top and you get a prize. Well, this guy was on the air, and someone was trying to tell him he had RF in his signal. And he said, "Oh, wait a minute, I'll turn the mic gain down." And the guy said, "That didn't do it. You got RF in your signal." And he said, "Oh, well, maybe I got the noise blanker on." Well, that may be the case that sometimes in receive, you have the noise blanker on, it'll make the signal distorted, but not on transmit. No matter what this guy was doing, he could not explain to him he had RF in the signal. So I said, I can't take this anymore. On the Quist software, they have a record function. So I recorded the guy, and then I broke him, and I said, I want you to listen to what your signal sounds like. So by putting it into record and pressing the mic into playback and pressing the mic button, what he said was they played back out of the air. And he said, that sounds like crap. And I said, that's what we're trying to tell you. It sounds like crap. So, I mean, this is really great because it was really, another guy was trying to adjust his mic. He had one of these control panels. You can adjust the mic. And I said, listen, make the changes and I'll record it. And I send it back to him. So, I mean, it was very valuable in these two cases that the station on the other end could hear what the signal sounds like. And so it's part of the software, but in fact, it's a capability that the HL2 has. So I think it's very invaluable from that standpoint. This is an updated number. I contacted KF70 here last week, and I think you got a copy of the, didn't Rod, you copy that email where you said there's about 1,000 of the units now in operation. Yes. So when I got mine about a year ago, there was about 600. Now, part of the reason that there's not 10,000 in there is these are built in blocks in China, and they build them in blocks of 100. So, they probably built 4 blocks. And of course, don't forget, COVID was right in the middle in there. So they probably weren't doing a lot of building. But now that maybe this thing is getting under control, you're going to see a lot more units being built. Now, there's some things to consider when you suit up with an HL2, and I'll use this term, the Techno Nerds factor. And I guess it kind of bothered me personally because, and I'm going to spend a minute or two about setting up the HL2. I was having a problem, so I got on the user group, and believe it or not, a ham from Germany, a DL, fires back at my question. He said, that's the stupidest question I've ever heard of. Why are you asking that? Well, to me, I didn't think that was very friendly. I mean, he could have said hey, you're missing the point. You need to look at the skeeter witch on the Framless saddle by the Morphostorm on the side of side and it's on the Akapaka Bay. And you do that, you got it. But to start off by saying, that's the stupidest question I've ever heard. And there are a lot of those techno nerds on that group, believe me. And you see some of the answers. And so you need to get over that it's being run by guys that eat, sleep software, work with cable modems, understand all this stuff, are networking experts, and have all this stuff at hand. You need to get over that. But it is disconcerting that they would not try to encourage people by answering the question in a positive way. Now, I get a lot of emails about projects I've done and things I've done, and I try to be real careful not to be a techno nerd in my response. I'll say, you need to look at this, or have you considered this? But this group, and unfortunately, it seems to be from Europe that does this. Now, the Hermes, not the Hermes Lite, but the Hermes is about a 10 or 12-year-old rig. It was really a techno rig. I mean, it was when the Flex Radius came out, someone came out with a Hermes, and you could put a lot of cash into something like that. And the Lite is a lot simpler. I suspect that these guys cut their teeth on the Hermes, and so they feel, well, I can make those statements because I'm an expert. But just don't be put off by that. Just understand that. Now, if you're a CW guy, there's a lot of lamenting and moaning and complaining about CW latency. Actually, if you heard yourself if you had a separate receiver hearing yourself, you get this echo chamber, and pretty soon you try to sync your speech to what you're hearing, and the brain can't compute that. I mean, it's like you're behind or ahead, and it drives you nuts. And I suspect on the CW operator, when they're monitoring their signal, and you can monitor your signal, it's kind of interesting to see that CW latency, especially high-speed CW, is a problem. I'm not a CW operator, so it doesn't bother me, but you can search the archives. If you're one of these 60 words a minute copy in your head CW guys, you might have a little problem with the HL2. The setup is not for the faint of heart. And I got to tell you, I spent 2 weeks trying to get the HL2 to work with WSJTX. There's a linkage between the two. And once you have the magic decoder ring, it takes you 30 seconds. But for the lack of real definition about how you use that magic decoder ring was really problematic. And so it almost was discouraging. But like setup, when you get it and you use like the Quist software, you have to go in and set all these pins to tell which bandpass filter you put in based on what band you're on. Then the power level is set digitally, but the problem is it's all at almost no power output. So if you don't make that setting, you're going to get 200 milliwatts and say, what's wrong with the radio? Well, you got to tell it, instead of putting a number, I think it's 70 in there, you got to put 240 or something like that, and then you get 5 watts. So I mean, these little things are not really clear, and it's the techno nerds all understand this, but for guys just starting out, so just understand that. But once you get it set up, you got it made. I highly recommend getting a 32-inch screen. You got all that spectrum you want to look at. 32-inch screens are not that expensive, but boy, does it make a difference when you want to look out at across all the signals. So it makes it kind of nice. Now, there's another problem. If you are a knob turner, there are no knobs to turn. You either got to use a mouse or a keyboard. And on the Quiz software, there's a little blank there next to the frequency. You can actually enter data on the keyboard if you want to move a frequency. Or if you got to go to eye-hand coordination, you can move that mouse back and forth. You might have seen me in some of those videos. I was moving the mouse back and forth. That's kind of tough. Or you can go over to the numbers themselves and use the scroll button and move the numbers up and down. But there's no mouse. There's no knob. Some guy that could write some software on knob software would really do me a favor. Believe me, I suffer from FFS, fat finger syndrome, and I got to tell you, it's incompatible with keyboards and mouses. So somebody out there that knows what to do with software to convert a mouse or keyboard commands into a knob would be doing the world a favor. Now, you do need an external computer, and I'm going to talk about that. I highly recommend putting this on a linear power supply, and you'll understand why when I share my experience with that. You can operate it with Cat5 signal cable, but you're going to run this over networks, and it may involve long lengths, and you are operating at some high frequency, high bit rates. Get the Cat6 signal cable. It's not that much more expensive, and it just plugs right in, and you don't know the difference between Cat5 or Cat6 except the hardware will. I highly recommend building a linear amplifier interface box, and I'll explain why in an upcoming slide. I did have an issue with some RFI at high power. I was driving an intermediate 100-watt amp, and that in turn was driving my SB 200. So I was running this thing at 600 watts. And because of coax cable and connections and some of that stuff, you're going to need a box of ferrite beads, put them on the cables and all that to prevent that feedback coming into the computer. And again, get all options, even the $1 assembly. Otherwise, you're liable to screw that up. So next slide, Rod. Okay, more of the details. Here's the computers that I have used with my HL2. I've used the Windows 10 Edge, and I've used the Linux Mint 20 on my big box computer. I converted that to Linux Mint 20. There was a deal on Amazon for the Atomic Pi, which came with Ubuntu. First thing you do is get rid of the Ubuntu and load Linux Mint 20 on it. But the thing that's neat about the Atomic Pi, it's got an Intel processor in it. And this thing came with a heat sink, and it came with a motherboard that you plugged everything into that had all the interface connections. And it came with a power supply, $39. $39 for this. I mean, it was a heck of a deal. And next to my big Linux Mint 20 box, I'd used the Atomic Pi. Now, the Raspberry Pi 3, I've had it working with the HL2, and I had a Raspberry Pi 4, but I got to tell you, the Raspberry Pi 4, I got heat sinks and fans on that thing, and it still runs hot. So I just spend $35 and get a Raspberry Pi 3. And as a matter of fact, if you buy a little device, a switching power supply from Meanwell, it'll take anywhere from 9 to 18 volts in and produce 5.25 volts at a couple of amps. So now you can run that off a battery in the field. So it Meanwell makes this nice switcher, 9 to 18 volts in, 5.25 volts out, and you need about 5.25 volts to make that thing work reliably. So I have actually a homebrew SDR radio that has that switcher power supply, and I run the Raspberry Pi off it. A really nice computer is the Asus Tinkerboard. The Asus Tinkerboard has got it's got more capability than the Raspberry Pi 3. There is one short side. I have not been able to load WSJTX on the Asus Tinkerboard. You got to make some kind of a mask, and you got to put this mask over here, and then you got to put this thing over here and do this. Joe Taylor explains how to do it, and I got to tell you, I said, you know what? I'll use it on the HL2, but I won't worry about doing WSJTX with it. But if I could crack that nut, or someone can crack that nut, the Asus Tinkerboard is a really good computer. Now, the software suites include Open HDSDR, and I'm using that, except it's only usable with a Windows machine. And if for those of you familiar with Power SDR, it's very much Power SDR, except when you look at the options in terms of rigs you can install it on, it's a Hermes and something else. So it's kind of limited to specifically to the Hermes or something else, whereas the Quisk, you can use it with the SoftRock, you can use it with the Hermes. There's a whole suite of rigs that you can use with. So that's why I prefer the Quisk. Now, I have not used SDR console. I think Frank is using SDR console. I'm not sure, but I think he's also using Open HDSDR. There's one called the Spark SDR, which is a CW skimmer software. So if you want to get into CW skimming, you can load the Spark SDR. I'm not familiar with the next two, but you see a lot of discussion on the reflector about Thetis. I don't know what that is, and SDR Play. I think SDR Play is useful with the dongles. I think a lot of guys use SDR console and SDR Play with a dongle. So those might be two that worth looking at. I got to tell you, the first time I ever used Linux was about 5 years ago, believe it or not, when I hooked up a Raspberry Pi 2 to a SoftRock. That was my first introduction to Linux. And I got to tell you, if I have to use software with a HL2, I would prefer the Linux over the Windows. First off, it's far simpler to install. The N2 ADR software with Quisk specifically says, okay, you want to use Windows, download these files. If you want to use Linux, download these files. And it seems like using Python with Windows is like brown shoes with a tuxedo, but you have to realize that Python is more in the Linux world than it is in the Windows world. So anyway, I do prefer the Linux, and a Raspberry Pi 3 is a great machine. Get the $35 version and you can be to town. Now, the computer interface, they start off by saying, and this is the Techno Nerd speaking, you can only use a cable modem. You have to use a cable modem to make this thing work. Well, I got to tell you, I bought a cable modem, but I didn't get exactly the right one, and it didn't work for me. And it was $125 for that cable modem, and I got a nice cable modem here that won't work with the HL2. I bought a 5-port network switch for $15. The Techno Nerds on the reflector says it can't work with the network switch. Well, friend, I got 4 computers on my network switch, and they all work with the HL2. So why are you telling me it doesn't work? Open your mind up that there's a possibility it could work. So this is the thing I get a little upset with the Techno Nerds. Start off by saying it won't work. It won't work. Now, some guys have even hooked direct. In other words, they didn't go through the cable modem or the network switch. They just plug it into the computer, and you'll hear 100 reasons why that won't work either. That it wants to see some network, and you got to have some kind of network address and what have you. But let me tell you, the 5-port network switch, and I have information on that in this presentation, works just fine, and it cost me $15. And I got this wonderful cable modem that's totally useless. So again, there are a lot of things that you learn from using this, but I guess the caution I would make is there's some really nice guys on the reflector, but it's the Techno Nerds that really bother me that start off by saying, you can't do that. That's the dumbest question I've ever heard. I mean, maybe I got presensitized to this, but trust me, if you work your way through it, it's a wonderful rig. Okay, next slide. Now, who operates QRP? Who operates QRP? There's an HL2 has a RCA jack in the back connected to an open drain MOSFET. I strongly recommend building an external amplifier interface. If you don't know how to build that, don't buy an HL2, but a small reed relay. And I guess this is a little tribal knowledge. You better put a snubber diode across that reed relay field coil, and you operate it from 12-volt DC supply, and you hook up the HL2 open gate MOSFET to key that. Now, there is a reason for this. Some of you may not realize, but the limitation on the MOSFET that's inside there, I think I say don't do any more than 28 volts. Some SB200 linear amplifiers, ones that have not been modified with a soft start and a soft switch, have 120 volts on that pin. So you got this 28 volt MOSFET that's trying to switch 120, because they take the bias voltage. They switch the bias voltage to ground to turn it into transmit. So unless you've modified an SB200, and this goes for some other relays, this has always been a problem with solid state gear and using solid state switching to switch on a linear amplifier. So you blow that MOSFET, I don't know how you ever replace it. So build the interface. Now, a good amplifier, a good match to this is from Communications Concepts, the AN762 amplifier. And the 3 photos below, you're looking at the AN762. Now, they have 2 versions of that, a 140 watt version and a 180 watt version. Get the 180 and you won't need a linear amplifier. I mean, in terms of running more power, that's just about the right power level. And what I did is I built it in the chassis, and those are some filters, low pass filters from Communications Concept, except I don't like the Communications Concepts filters, so I modified them to the W3NQN filter standard. W3NQN has a paper on how to build these filters with the values for all the bands. And the reason that the W3NQN filters are desirable is they address the second harmonic. So you can take the CCI, they sell those filter boards, they're about $15 a piece. You can take them and modify them to the W3NQN, and it's well worth it. And the last picture there on the bottom, I homebrewed a band switch. I took 2 sections, joined them with some couplings so that you're switching in the output and the input of that. Instead of trying to do it with one relay, I actually switched the output so that they're fully isolated. So you need to pay attention to grounding. Anybody that doesn't operate the station with a station ground, you're going to get RF feeding back in there, and use good quality coax cable. I found that some of the coax cable I had been around for about 15 years or so, not very good. It kind of frayed, from connecting it, reconnecting it, come unsoldered. So spend some money and get some good quality coax, and invest in the ferrite cable beads. Kind of a funny story. One of the first computer controlled transceivers on the market was from Tentec, called the Pegasus. And man, that was a stomach turner to get that thing to work. And I got it sort of okay after I made some changes, but every once in a while the computer would hang up, and I had ferrite beads on everything except one thing, the mouse. I did not have a ferrite bead on the mouse, and every once in a while it would pick RF, depending upon where the mouse was, it would pick up RF. And finally I said, okay, last place. I put the ferrite bead on the mouse and solved the problem. So, I mean, I learned the hard way that, this RF gets around the shack. And so that's a real concern. But anyway, you can operate it with higher power. But I will tell you, I think the 5 watt level of the HL2, especially what's happening with cycle 20. Here, I'm tying it back into cycle 25. With cycle 25, what's happening is 5 watts is plenty. Now, I lived through cycle 19. I had a Heathkit tenor that I ran mobile. And the most I ever got out of that is about 2 watts. And I worked all kind of DX on 10 meters in cycle 19. So 5 watts, especially with the better receivers and the better transmitters and the modes like digital, is plenty. So you can have a barrel of fun. If you want to buy an amp, take a look at the 762. Okay. Now, the question is, where can I buy an HL2? Now, they're starting a new build. And about 3 weeks, that build is going to be done and up for sale. So you got to go to that website, and it's the Group Buy Wiki. And you can click on that, and it'll tell you in stock or not in stock. But the latest information from Steve is they've started the new build. And he said it takes about 4 weeks to produce 100 units. So if you want that, keep checking that, and then you can get in there. It takes you right to the website, and you can order it from there, and you can use things like PayPal. I think PayPal is the method of purchasing. Here's the network switch. It's made by TP-Link, and it's a TLSG105, made by TP-Link. And that's the unit I'm using. $15. It'll do everything you need to do. I got 4 different computers hooked up to that network switch. And of course, one of them goes to the Hermes Lite. Now, I recommended the use of the linear power supply, and I use a pyramid model PSK8. Last Christmas, I noticed something on my spectrum. About every 50 kilohertz, I saw a blip. Every 50 kilohertz, I saw a blip. And I said, what the hell's that? So I disconnected the antenna, and I still saw the blip. And I said, you know what? I bet you now there's two possibilities I had. Someone had some Christmas lights that were blinking on and off, and that was causing enough signal coming through the power line to see it. Or the nice looking lady down the street was back. And I mean by that is there's this nice looking lady, single lady down the street. And what I didn't know is she was growing marijuana in her house. It was the grow lights. Well, they legalized marijuana growing here in California, so she moved to an industrial park. But I mean, it drove me nuts. I'd see this interference. I said, she can't be back. What it was the switching power supply in my computer. The switching power supply was doing it. And I found that out I switched over from the main Linux Mint box to the Atomic Pi, and suddenly the spectrum cleared up. So I put it back, there it was, put it on the Atomic Pi, so it's got to be the power supply. So I bought a new power supply. So I said, if the computer power supply is doing that, I don't want a switching power supply supplying power to the HL2. The Pyramid PSK8, about 6 amps or so. It's not much bigger than the HL2, and a good linear supply is what the doctor ordered. Now, I made my first ever 12 meter contact on sideband at 5 watts with the HL2. So cycle 25 has great promise that you can consistently make 12 meter contacts at 5 watts. And I found FT8 on 17 meters is better than 20. And the reason is that you have all these guys running high power on 20 meters, and you have all these guys running reasonable power on 17, and you have a chance to be heard. So I every day I'll check 17 meters, and it doesn't look like there's any phone or CW signals, but you go to 18.1, and that thing is spiking up there, and you just hear them. And hearing a lot of DX, as I said yesterday, even on phone, I heard the guy down in Costa Rica talking to the guy in Japan, and I heard both sides of the conversation. So that's got to tell you something about cycle 25. And so this is a really, really good time. Now, again, RFI back in the HL2. I didn't see it normally running like 5 watts or 100 watts, but I did see it running the SB200. So it invests in some ferrite beads. Okay, next slide. Now, you asked about the Bray. Even as a junior op, I found that the Bray was a terrific chick magnet. So, I mean, look at that guy. Who could turn that down, So someone asked about the Bray. There you go. Of course, sunglasses work well, too. Now, I want to thank you. And if you have any questions, you can contact me at my email address, craponthebench. And CRAP, by the way, is an acronym for Cool Radios and Projects. So if you wondered what CRAP stood for, it's Cool Radios and Projects. And that doesn't show up too well on my screen, but there are some various websites that I have. I have about a dozen websites. One of them deals with SDR. and I've used that I built a couple of homebrew SDR transceiver. You can see how that's documented. You've got my regular n6qw.com website. JS Systems is an older website, but it has a lot of good information on it. Now, you find that lots of hams do things other than ham radio. They play music, or they are into photography, and some guys cook. I happen to be one of those foodie guys, so there's some good recipes on pastapete.com. And I found out something interesting. Of all the websites I own, it seems like Pasta Pete is worth the most money. I mean, people are asking me, would I sell that to them? So I'm just holding on to it. Anyway, thank you very much for the chance to share some information on the HL2, and I think I'm done.
Thank you, Pete. I do have a question right out of the gate. When you went to replace your power supply for the PC, were you looking for a particular type of power supply? Anything that were you able to compare specs on those, or somebody?
Yes. Yeah. Now, I should tell you that at one time I owned a computer business. I used to build computers. So I went to one of my supplier sources and I said, okay, if I'm going to buy a computer replacement power supply, which one would you suggest? And they said, take a look at this one. And I did upsize it. I think I put a 550 watt in there, and what was in there was a 350. You buy the case with the supply, and you buy a case and the supply, and it's $30. That's gonna tell you something. Well, power supply I put in there cost me 45, so it really made a difference. But you look at the noise specs, and look at a better quality brands of supplies. And as I said, I went to my former computer supplier, parts supplier, and I said, what's a good one? He said, get this one. So I kind of trusted what they said, but it really pays to look at that. And I would have never thought it's the computer. Well, I mean, the computer worked fine. It's just the HL2 was picking up the switching noise, and it was just something. I had it working with the HL2 for about 4 or 5 months, and I never saw that. It was just suddenly around Christmas time that it showed up.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the crew? Switch it over to the main view.
Hi, Pete. This is Mark Smith, Smitty from Ham Radio Workbench again. You mentioned something about transverter options or possible new features that they're going to add to the next build. Did I miss you talking about that?
No, I just said that you check the reflector. There's a discussion about transverters. As a matter of fact, the reflector also has lots of guys are buying this Hard Rock 50 amplifier, the Hard Rock 50 amplifier. They went with the Hard Rock transceiver, I think. So check the reflector, because there's some discussion on that. I didn't look at the detail. I get a feed every morning. It says, okay, transverters. And I said, well, I'm not interested in that, but I know that there's discussions going on about it. So that's being looked at seriously. And I would suspect, Smitty, that given what's happened with cycle 25, there's going to be a lot of interest in 6 and 2 meter.
Yeah.
Sideband DX. So guys are going to be looking at what do I need to do so I can dial in 6 and 2. Now, as a matter of fact, in our latest podcast, Bill mentioned that there's some talk about returning some of the VHF frequencies between 6 meters and the FM band back to amateur use. So what I'd like to see here in the U.S. is 4 meters. 4 meters would be really cool, because there's a lot of gear in the UK. I know they operate a lot of 4 meters. So there's a lot of gear that's available. And I'm sure that once that takes place, it'd be nice to be able to swing the HL2 to 4 meters. Now, you can't do, because of the bandpass filter board that's in there, it only goes up to 10 meters. So that's why you would need a transverter. It's not just a matter of, I'll put another filter in there. Well, it's on the board. I don't think you can do the surgery on it. So a transverter becomes your answer. And I would suspect that they would look to a 28 megahertz to 2, or 28 megahertz to 6. That seemed to be the popular transverters. And likely there's ones on the market right today will work. But you know what happens when you get with the techno nerds? They got to pull the thing apart and look at all the things that they need to do.
Yeah, I also wanted to +1 your comment about being a jerk to people who are still trying to learn a thing. That is unacceptable. That is absolutely unacceptable. That's the stupid question. You never answer a question like that. Anyone who does needs a swift kick to the shins. That's completely inappropriate. So thank you for bringing that up.
You bet.
Yeah. The reason I was interested in the transverters is that it looks like the Hermes Lite 2 with a 2 meter and a 440 transverter would make a decent radio for trying to do linear satellites, because it's relatively inexpensive and all mode and whatnot. And so being able to transvert up to VHF and UHF, I think would be a really cool feature for that.
Well, maybe a suggestion to you is join the reflector. And then
get in and mention that.
Yeah. Join the reflector, say, hey, we're looking at cycle 25. What about, 2 meters and 440? What's in the realm that would work with that? And they'll either tell you can or can't. I mean, the power level, you'd have to cut that back, but you can do that in one of the panels. You can adjust the power level. So, 5 watts is probably too much to put into the transverter. You probably want to put 100 milliwatts, maybe.
Milliwatts, yeah.
So you can adjust that power down. So you'd have to go in and digitally adjust that. I think the numbers are, like I say, 70 to 240 or something like that. So you'd have to pick something in the 70 that you can adjust the power level down. But that's easy to do. Yeah. And especially on 10 meters, you could say, okay, adjust it down to the 70 number and then as 100 milliwatts. But join the reflector. I'm sure there's people in there thinking like you are, say, hey, let's get on this thing.
That'd be cool. All right. Thanks, Pete.
Jake, did you have a question there?
I did not. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I'm calling on the wrong people. Very good. So for the rest of the crew, any questions? Don't be shy. Okay, Pete, I want to thank you. This has been an awesome presentation. I've been meaning to get you on with the crew for a long time. We will, of course, be posting this out to the Cycle 25 YouTube channel. And I'm hoping to talk you into coming back for a follow-up at some point. But thank you so much for the research and a really great, crisp presentation there.
Thank you. Maybe you can answer a question for me. Okay. Bill Mira, N2CQR, sent me a link to Steve McDonald, VE7SL, and he was talking about cycle 25. And he was saying that we're coming up to month 21. And he said this month 21, what they're looking at the sunspot data is tracking with cycle 19.
Yes.
So can you tell me the straight scoop? Where are we? What's going to happen?
I am not the expert on this. I'm simply an optimist. But what I am going to do is I'm going to link you back to a presentation that was done by a fellow out of Colorado who leads a bunch of solar research down there, and did an excellent presentation for us a couple of weeks ago in detail on how this is not just an 11-year cycle. This is in fact overlapping 11-year cycles.
Is that the Dr. McKenzie, Scott McKenzie?
There is, yeah.
Okay,
Scott.
Cool.
And Scott is a bit of a rebel in his own community, and we are really pulling for him because the data is looking good. It's really compelling. I hope he gets the evidence that he needs because he's got quite a bit of research on there. And as I said, I'll refer you back to the other presentation because he'll do a much better job than I will. But as a enthusiast of the topic, I'm convinced. We're just
he just tweeted the other day that I think yesterday that it looked like the Terminator may have finally happened.
That was the term, the Terminator. Yeah. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator. There you go.
Exactly. Yeah. He just tweeted yesterday. I think I saw that it looks like it may have finally happened.
Fantastic. Okay.
You know, as a suggestion, I'm sorry for interrupting you. A suggestion would be, I was ill prepared for cycle 19. I had just gotten my license and I got on 40 meters, and I thought it was kind of cool. I had this 10-meter rig, but I'd like to see someone talk about being prepared. Had I really fully understood the impact of cycle 19, I would have built a 15-meter phone rig and built a simple 15-meter 2-element beam. I mean, yeah, I worked some stuff on 10 meters, but it'd be much more productive. If we really understand the full impact of cycle 15, we'll look at some hardware, some simple hardware that will allow us to operate. Get key. I'd like to see some software that you can go to a website and says, okay, go here this time, this band, and do it. I mean, you see a lot of the technical stuff. You got to really understand all the things that they're saying. And it would be really useful if someone says, okay, go here, this band, this time, and do it. And I'd also like to see some things that say, antennas. What are some simple antennas that you could build to take advantage? I mean, I know of a guy that had an ICOM 7800, and he was loading a piece of wire of his garage floor and wondering why he was making no contacts. Well, he could have had a much less expensive radio with a good antenna. So if someone could kind of address the whole subject, how to take advantage of cycle 25, kind of the hardware, the software, kind of the antenna, what you can do, operational times, and put a package together. The other thing I'd like to see is some of that stuff that would deal with the portability. How can you take the stuff portable? I mean, COVID's going to get to a point where we can finally get out of our house. What greater thing than go to some place that you got a small 15-meter beam with a small rig and you're working the world on 2 watts? Why not? But I mean, someone could grab that'd really be useful, and it really do the hobby a great service if you could look at that piece. I was ill prepared. I was 18 years old, and of course, ham radio was only the one thing on my mind. That was 40%. The other 60% was girls. So, so I didn't take full advantage of what I could have when cycle 19 was around. So I think it's here, and it could rival 19. I know what 19 was like. It could rival 19. So why not take advantage of it by getting prepared?
Rod, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I still don't have my video running. Pete, it's V3HG Peter here in Oakville. I was on 17 meters last night on FT8 running 5 watts, and I'm decoding Japan and VKs on a ground mounted HF6 vertical. So it's starting to happen, and JA from here is tough. Yeah, it's I was going to say tough. I was going to go more for significant. I mean, when it's open, you can run streams of JAs, but not like you guys can down in California, on the West Coast. It's a difference. So 17 is open. I'm just rewiring. Matter of fact, I'm just you can't see it, but I'm rewiring the FT8 station so that it's in a more permanent position, running one of my antennas, and just let it run in the background as an indicator of whether the bands are open or not. So very much agree with you. Also, I'm running SDR here a lot, and I've been doing that for a decade. I'm a convert to SDR, and any of those rigs I think are just, if any of the guys haven't done that yet, it's well worth it. It's you get a decent SDR rig running it can be jaw dropping. I run here, Pete, a Flex 6600. I also run Drake TR4Cs. I've got a couple of them. My dad was in Drake, so I've got Drake equipment here, as well as a KX2. And as Sherwood talks about, the sensitivity on all those rigs is essentially the same. Really, we beat sensitivity 20 years ago. It's when it comes to selectivity that an SDR rig can just make your jaw drop. It can be just. Even a simple one can just be a real education. Anyway, Rod, I will figure out my video here sooner or later, and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, Pete, I'm going to take that prepare for cycle 25 as a challenge and take that on. I love the idea, because we've been meaning to, I mentioned before, Dante and Ilya on the call here are 2 of our Padawans. They're both, teenagers and doing extremely well with us, and I think it's a nearly ideal topic for them. to work with us on. So with that, I'm going to close off the recording, and thank you so much, Pete, for spending some time with us.
You bet. My pleasure. And thank you for inviting me. Take care.